Hello, I'm AJ Camacho with WRGW News. Here for PINDROP today on our episode in Ukraine, we are talking to Eli McCarthy. He's joining me now via Zoom. He is a professor at George Washington University and Georgetown University, where he teaches peace and justice studies. Professor McCarthy has been to Ukraine twice in recent months, and we'll be starting there. Professor McCarthy, you have been to Ukraine twice, as I understand it, on these sort of interfaith solidarity, advancing nonviolent peace building sort of trips. Could you explain to our listeners what exactly that means? What was your experience in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be with you all. So I was able to go to Ukraine at the end of May in 2022, as well as the end of August of this year. So the May trip kind of materialized as me and a number of other kind of activists and peace builders were trying to discover how we could be helpful and be in solidarity. And then the mayor of Kiev actually made a public pronouncement inviting or making an appeal to the world's spiritual leaders to take a stand and to, he called, assume the responsibility of their religions for peace. And he invited religious leaders, spiritual leaders to come to Kiev and to be in solidarity and so forth. So we organized a number of religious leaders, mostly from Europe and some from the US, a few other nearby locations, and about 17 ended up going on this delegation, and it was Jewish, Muslim, Christian leaders, including Anglican Bishop Joe Wells from the UK, and an Italian imam who was the head of the European Muslim leaders, as well as a representative from the Vatican and kind of the Just Peace Commission for Religious Orders. So, while we were there, our purpose in general was solidarity, but also trying to create more space and kind of like humanizing energy to enhance the protection of civilians, to reduce violence, to increase humanitarian aid, to try to accelerate an end to the war. So we engaged in some interfaith prayers, some pastoral accompaniment in terms of listening to people's stories, helping to distribute food and some humanitarian aid to elderly and others who had kind of lost their homes, as well as meeting with local peace builders and religious leaders and political leaders from the mayor's office in Kiev, as well as the national office. So while we were there, it was really I thought of it as a nonviolent action because it was communicating a kind of positive reverence for dignity and life, as well as this effort to try to avoid dehumanization and participating in other types of violence, really kind of broadening the moral imagination about what might be possible. So one of the more kind of moving moments for me was, in addition to kind of meeting some of the elderly and hearing their stories, was actually walking through a building. It was called the House of Culture, and it was bombed. It was all dust everywhere, and the ceiling had kind of metal rods hanging down, and we were just kind of silently walking through this building, which had about 3 or 4 different large rooms, and there's this immense sense of darkness that kind of many of us felt. And we decided to kind of spontaneously form a circle and pray as a way to try to challenge the darkness and the destructive power of violence with a sense of power of life, power of resurrection, and so forth. So that was the one kind of moment that really emotionally got to me. But there were also, this was a way to challenge some of the sources of power that were enabling the Russians to enact this invasion. One of those is called the intangible source of power, and this is sort of like the ideology or the narratives that Russian leaders use to kind of justify. So one of those is the Russian world ideology, and some how that's connected to sort of Orthodox Christianity and so forth. So we were there to challenge some of that, to kind of try to shift some of the narrative and the religious practices and so forth. So, as we left, what some of the things we heard was that like humanitarian aid was really lacking, and peace building aid was really needed, such as trauma healing and support for people who were doing nonviolent non-cooperation. And there was a desire for more delegations. So, after that delegation, additional delegations went in the end of June to Odessa, back to Kiev in July, as well as another one to Kiev in August. And we also found that, one of our advocacy calls was for more humanitarian aid, and the European Union did kind of scale up humanitarian aid in early June, kind of shortly after our trip. And another call was to try to get an agreement on the grain. And thankfully that was agreed to around the end of July, so that would flow out of the ports around Odessa. So the second trip was at the end of August, and this was with a group, Peace Institute based in Romania, as well as some other European partners. And we went to Kiev to meet with a number of local peace builders and nonviolent activists from the occupied territories. And they were meeting to kind of build up collaboration and strategies, but they also shared some of their stories of resistance and the needs they had, different kinds of needs for support and resources. So, some stories from the occupied territories were about Ukrainian farmers refusing to sell grain to Russian soldiers, fire department refusing to join the Russian kind of emergency system structure, civilians protecting local administrative officials and leaders of schools so that they wouldn't be kidnapped and so forth. And then really kind of strategies to engage Russian civil society members on the reality of war and ways that they could speak out against it. There was actually a report that came out shortly after this trip, and they mapped about 235 nonviolent actions across Ukraine between like the first 4 or 5 months of the war. And what they found was that nonviolent resistance actually hindered some of the long-term military and political goals of the Russian authorities, such as the institutionalization of the military occupation and repression in the occupied territories. It also helped to protect many civilians, undermine the Russian narrative, build community resilience, and kind of strengthen local governance. So the people that we met on the trip were very clear. They said, we want our stories to be shared, our examples of nonviolent non-cooperation. And they wanted help with advocating their government, as well as the governments that we were from, myself being from the United States, to advocate these governments to support them more by developing a piece of strategy focused on kind of nonviolent non-cooperation with the occupation. They were feeling like their home government in Kiev was mostly telling them, don't do this, don't do that. You don't want to look like you're a collaborator or you're going to get fined or punished. And what they really wanted was their government to help support them in their resistance and their non-cooperation, and to, develop a strategy, provide resources. But they're also hoping for training in like digital security and training in strategic campaigns, and ultimately that they don't be left alone. So, one of the other people we met there, who was in Kharkiv, in sort of the northern part of the northeast part of Ukraine, was a conflict monitor. And she was getting some funding from the UN and other places. And what she found was that in the occupied areas where nonviolent resistance was the primary method, that those Ukrainians actually then faced less repression in response to that kind of resistance. Whereas in the areas where they leaned more on violent resistance, those Ukrainians would face increased repression in response to that kind of resisting. So this was a pretty eye-opening kind of experience and testimony. So those are some of the main things that we learned. There is a group called the Nonviolent Peace Force, which is in Mykolaiv and Kharkiv in Ukraine, that are providing unarmed protection, particularly to the elderly, the disabled, and the children, and so forth. But let me pause there.
Yeah, that is actually very remarkable. I think that the experiences of Russian civilians in the of Ukrainian civilians in the occupied territories is something that we are mostly hearing about through reports. We're not hearing a lot of specific stories. It's very fascinating to hear about the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance in these scenarios. I think that's something that can get quite overlooked. I want to turn now along these lines of the generation of peace. You're talking a lot about the tactics that people in these areas have been able to implement, this non-cooperation with various aspects under Russian occupation. Turning to the more international scale of things, there have been some realist international relations scholars like John Mearsheimer, who have argued that the US, in pushing to expand NATO eastward and establishing friendly relations with Ukraine, has increased the likelihood of war because they laid this groundwork for Vladimir Putin to be very aggressive towards Ukraine, great power politics type stuff. Do you view it that way? Do you think that we are in this situation because these Western powers were trying to be friendly towards Ukraine? And also, do you think that this international side of things, how do you see this playing into potential peace in the long run?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, trying to identify some of the root causes of a large-scale conflict is one of the critical kind of methods of a just peace approach to conflict, right? A just peace approach tries to look at the root causes and then try to identify three basic areas of activity. One is like, skills or virtues to engage conflict constructively. The second one is like norms to break cycles of violence. And the third one is norms to build a more sustainable peace. So, if we kind of lean into a just peace orientation on thinking about this conflict, this particular war really began in 2014, right? When there was kind of a shift that happened in the Ukrainian space. And what happened was that, there was political conflict, and this led to the Maidan demonstrations that ended up changing government leadership, which was Russian leaning at the time. The Russians then annexed Crimea, and there's violence that breaks out kind of both directions. And then they form these agreements, these Minsk agreements. And this was around 2015 or so. And part of those agreements was this call for dialogue between the Ukrainian government at the time and the leaders of the separatist regions in the eastern part of Ukraine. And they were to dialogue to kind of form some kind of political autonomy, which meant Ukraine would still control eastern Ukraine, but those particular regions would have a different kind of autonomy, a different kind of political autonomy. And they were supposed to kind of try to figure out what that would look like. And there was a couple other, commitments by both sides in the agreements, but instead what ended up happening was that dialogue really didn't materialize. You ended up getting primarily this counterterrorism operation for about 7 years, and steady kind of escalation from both sides in terms of violent responses to each other. And essentially a failure then to implement these Minsk agreements. So, more recently, the leadership from these key areas in the Donbas region kind of declared independence and then seemed to signal a welcome to the Russians to more formally kind of invade or increase the the violent dynamic. So, I think those are some of the critical pieces to kind of think about. Certainly more general things like the increase of NATO or increase of militarization of a region is almost always going to sort of increase anxiety in people that are around that space, whether it's in Europe or in Africa or South America or so forth. But, these are some of these critical things about the Minsk agreements and what's really happened over the past 10 years at this point. Because what it kind of illustrates is that, the primary strategy kind of since this recent invasion in February, particularly by the UK and the US, has really been to support Ukraine with militarization. And this is kind of a continuation of the efforts like since 2015 when there was militarization going on in Ukraine and weapons and training happening. So, now we have about 8 million internally displaced persons, about 7 million refugees, about 6,000 civilians killed, another 400 children that were killed, and tens of thousands of soldiers killed, with this significant ramping up of militarization in Europe and kind of untold ecological damage. So, I don't think this can be characterized as success, regardless of whoever may kind of ultimately win this particular war. So if we were to kind of think about, like how do we sort of move forward or break some of these cycles of violence? One of the key things has been what we've kind of discussed is supporting these courageous Ukrainians and many courageous Russians that are participating in non-cooperation, nonviolent resistance. And some of them are, taking serious risks, going to prison, and particularly in Russia, and other types of kind of significant risks. So we actually know from research that nonviolent resistance is twice as effective as violent resistance in obtaining political objectives. And it's also, and this is probably most important, is it's at least 10 times more likely to lead to a more durable democracy. And that's including against authoritarians and in situations of occupation. So there's some significant advantages to really trying to invest more in that particular strategy and to kind of scale that up. But the other critical piece is this kind of emphasis on dialogue or diplomatic engagement. I mean, one of the main kind of arguments right now is that, that negotiations are only valuable kind of after some kind of military advantage on the ground. And many key political leaders are kind of resisting negotiations. Now, we already had a mediated dialogue that succeeded in July with agreements on the grain shipments. So we have that experience with us. But this sort of logic that negotiations are only valuable after a military advantage on the ground, in light of kind of a just peace approach, this kind of represents kind of succumbing to a distorted logic, a capitulation to the mentality of justification's dynamic of war. And such negotiations rarely, if ever, really yield sustainable solutions, since humanization, consideration of needs, reconciliation are not normally prioritized. And often women are usually marginalized at best from these kinds of negotiations. So, leaning into a more consistent kind of needs-based dialogue that has some flexibility and some willingness to negotiate and to think about who are the credible messengers that can really help move that forward, right? Is it Turkey? Is it some other mix of leaders? But that's got to be where an important focus is if we want to ultimately break the cycles of violence. Because as we can see, you know, there's one particular bombing and then another bombing, and the countries just kind of respond to each other. And then you have all this anxiety about nuclear war, which would be even more horrendous. So really focusing on how do we break the cycle of violence. And I think two key parts are the nonviolent resistance support as well as the dialogue. And there's other things that can be critical too, in terms of, like, you know, thinking about particular ways of doing ceasefires, right? For example, you can have ceasefires in particular towns, the whole thing all at once, and see how that goes. And then you bring in monitors and observers and so forth. And you can kind of go through a process and see if you can gradually start kind of building a little bit more trust. And then starting to get to, you know, withdrawing of Russian troops and so forth. But in order to really move in that direction, there's going to be a willingness to dialogue. And, you know, as part of that process, kind of a gradual invitation for the key parties to start acknowledging responsibility for harm, particularly Russia, right? To acknowledge the killing of civilians, for example, and so forth. That can help kind of generate this movement of dialogue and taking steps through a kind of gradual ceasefire process.
Yeah, I think even in my studies of history, I would say there's an argument to be had that the most productive peace talks actually happen when there is no military advantage on the ground either way. To be sure, that's something historians no doubt have their own debates about. But lastly, just a half a minute, Professor McCarthy, you mentioned earlier one or two organizations that you are aware of working with the humanitarian aspect of things. There are a lot of GW students who feel very strongly about this crisis that we're seeing in Ukraine right now. What would you advise to them if they were interested in trying to help out?
Yeah, so I can give you a couple of names, and then if you want me to share some links with you and you can post them someplace, I can do that as well.
Of course.
But one of the organizations is called PATRIR, which is the Peace Action Training Institute in Romania. And they've actually been doing a lot of support for the peace builders, nonviolent activists. And one of their partners is called Un Pont Per. It's UNPONTEPER. And it's based in Italy, but they actually have a link to a place where people can donate, and the money will go to these local peace builders and nonviolent activists in Ukraine. So I can share that link with you if you're able to get it out in any way. Those would be a couple key places. And the other piece, I think, is advocacy, right? People who are listening to this and really want to try to make a contribution to advocate their government officials to really press for getting back to negotiations and thinking about who the credible messengers are, but also more resources, more investment in supporting these local civil society peace builders and nonviolent activists, both in Ukraine and Russia. There's a gradual kind of movement going on right now where Russian soldiers are but increasingly defecting and kind of disobeying orders and so forth. So the more that can be coordinated and those folks can be supported, particularly if they're able to kind of get out of that space. I know a few recently Russian soldiers got into Alaska, so people are trying to figure out how to support them, for example. So those would be some things. You know, you can directly donate, you can advocate the government to do the diplomacy to support the nonviolent resistance in Russia and Ukraine.
Professor McCarthy, Professor Eli McCarthy, Professor of Peace Studies and Peace and Justice at Georgetown University and at George Washington University. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.